Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of our panels in this wonderful new series by the Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Ethics called Technology and the World Around Us. My name is Tyne Sumner and I'm your moderator for today's session. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne, and a member of the team here at CADE, and I have a focus in my role here on digital ethics and the intersection of humanities fields with digital surveillance. I'm joining you all from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, also known as Melbourne, on the Parkville campus at the University of Melbourne. And I pay my respect to Wurundjeri elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal people here in today's session. A very quick note too that this session is being recorded. So if you don't want your face to appear on the camera, feel free to turn that off. So before I give a bit of context for our really exciting panel today, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. First, we have speaking today Professor Stephanie Trigg, who is the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor of English here at the University of Melbourne. Stephanie led the Melbourne node of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in the History of Emotions, and is currently, among many, many other things, the lead investigator on the ARC Discovery Project, Literature and the Face, A Critical History, together with Dr. Jo Hughes and myself here at the University of Melbourne, and Professor Guillemette Boylens at the University of Geneva. Our second speaker today is Dr. Vanessa Bartlett, who is the Mackenzie Postdoctoral Fellow in the School of Culture and Communication. Her research and practice span digital art, curating, the intersection of art and science, and digitally mediated performance. She's interested in the ways that curatorial practice and arts-led research can help inquiry into well-being, emotion, and affect in the digital age. Vanessa's current project explores artists' responses to pervasive design. And finally, our third panelist, Dr. Niels Walters, is unfortunately able to join us today. However, we're very lucky to have an esteemed late replacement in the form of Dr. Mark Chong. Mark is a senior fellow at the Melbourne Law School and a digital ethicist here at the Centre for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Ethics. And his research interests include the intersection of technology and philosophy, including intersections between existentialism, epistemology, and social media data. What a lineup, my goodness. Before I throw to these incredible panelists, a couple of words on our subject matter today: human experience, expression, and emotion in the datafied age. I myself was first prompted to think about issues at the intersection of tech and emotion after coming across the New York Times piece late last year entitled, "Do these AI-created fake people look real to you?" Well, we've all known a fake person here and there, I'm sure, but what does it mean when artificial intelligence creates a fake person? As this article tells us, quote, "There are now businesses that sell fake people. On the website generatedphotos.com, you can buy a unique worry-free face of a fake person for $2.99, or even 1,000 faces of people for $1,000. You just need a couple of fake people to make your company website look more diverse or to appear in a video game. Get them from thispersondoesnotexist.com and adjust their likeness as needed." As these developments show us, we have indeed reached a kind of dystopian age when it comes to what might be the narrowing gap between the authentic, the artificial, and the digitally unethical. However, misleading emotions and facial deception have been around much longer than some of us might like to think. We were made aware, for example, of this complexity at the end of Act 1, Scene 7 in William Shakespeare's Macbeth, when Macbeth declares, "Away and mock the time with fairest show, false face must hide what the false heart doth know." In this critical scene, Macbeth resolves to murder King Duncan and take the throne of Scotland for himself, But he speaks not to Lady Macbeth, who might stand nearby, but rather he addresses himself, revealing the duplicitous and misleading capacity of the face in the context of social upheaval and political struggle. Shakespeare reminds us here that the face can tell multiple stories at once, depending on who's doing the face and who's doing the looking. Moreover, in arts and arts practice, we've also pushed the boundaries of how we can understand and interpret expression, especially of faces. The abstract architecture of Pablo Picasso's The Weeping Woman, as you can see here, broke with artistic convention to present facial expression through complex distortion. The auction house Christie's famously described the face in this painting as the timelessly universal messenger of unfathomable and inconsolable human sorrow. From physical art to the world of performance art, some of you might recall the well-known Serbian artist Marina Abramovic's extended work, The Artist is Present, in which Abramovic shares a period of silence with the stares and faces of strangers. Seated silently across a table from an empty chair, she remained as still as possible as people took turns sitting in the chair and staring into her face. Over the course of nearly 3 months, for 8 hours a day, thousands of strangers met Abramovic's face, many of whom were moved to tears. And more recently, in an article in The Atlantic entitled "Artificial Intelligence is Misreading Human Emotion," the Australian composer and academic Kate Crawford contends that there is no good evidence to suggest that facial expressions reveal a person's feelings, but big tech companies want you to believe otherwise. This crucial claim, I think, responds to the recent growth of so-called affect recognition tools that are increasingly found in all kinds of pockets of everyday life, from classrooms and airports and shopping malls through to even, some might find concerningly, job recruitment software. So why is digital technology so eager to locate and track our facial expressions and emotions? And how did affect recognition tools come to be a part of the artificial intelligence industry? What problems do they present, especially as they evolve in increasingly intense and sophisticated ways? As the psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett observed in a 2019 study, it is not possible to confidently infer happiness from a smile, anger from a scowl, or sadness from a frown, as much as the current technology tries to do when applying what are mistakenly believed to be scientific facts. Our panelists today might not necessarily have all the answers to these questions, but I'm sure they'll have plenty to say about them. They're each going to speak about their own research and their own unique angle on this topic as it relates to human experience and emotion in the datafied age. And then we'll move to some questions, time permitting. So please keep yourself muted and add any thoughts or questions to the chat as we go along. And I will hand over now to Stephanie.
Thank you, Tyne, and greetings, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm speaking from the lands of the Gulajan and Gadibanud people down in the Otways, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to Indigenous people with us today. The face has long been considered a privileged site for conceptualizing the human. Where have I gone? Sorry. Our faces help us articulate relationships with each other, with different forms of cultural, racial, and ethnic alterity, with other species, and also, according to many philosophers, with the divine. We observe faces all the time, assessing them according to changing cultural standards of beauty, normality, or disfigurement, and through a series of complex cognitive, perceptual, and increasingly technological modalities. The most obvious way of analysing facial emotion and expression seems to be through visual images. Facial emotion in art, sculpture, cinema, and other visual media is dramatic and immediate. Equally, in more self-conscious and analytic studies, in the long history of physiognomy, for example, images of human faces are consistently used to illustrate the differences between emotions. This history stretches from medieval and early modern or Renaissance manuals to the drawings of Charles Lebrun in the 17th century, or Johann Lavater in the 18th, to Charles Darwin's treatise on emotions in the 19th century, and particularly for us, I suppose, the influential work of psychologist Paul Ekman in the late 20th century, whose visual arrays of faces and emotions are probably familiar. In contrast, literary texts, my prime concern, offer far more layered and indirect representations of the face, facial gesture, and emotion. These representations are less immediate, but they have the advantage of slowing us right down to consider some of the cognitive, affective, and cultural pathways by which we understand each other's faces. Fiction and film are sometimes referred to as empathy machines. I think empathy is only one of many things these media offer, but the idea of literature as a kind of machine with its own systems and patterns for showing and teaching us about emotions is an intriguing and probably productive one. I'm going to share just one example that shows how literature both appeals to and also, I argue, teaches us about these patterns and processes of emotional understanding. It's an extremely famous example from Jane Austen's Persuasion, written in 1818. I just hope that's going to come up in the chat screen, in the chat there now, so you can have a look as I'm working on it. Several years before the main action of Persuasion begins, the heroine, Anne Elliot, is encouraged by her friends to reject the marriage proposal of a man who is not of the right wealth or class. Anne's health and appearance suffer as a result of this disappointment, but she eventually recovers her sense of self. And in the novel, the action often revolves around where the former lovers are thrown together again by circumstance, mostly familial circumstance. Their relationship is clearly strained. But one day they were out walking in a group and they encounter a stranger who is obviously struck by Anne's appearance. And this is the narrator. It was evident that the gentleman, completely a gentleman in manner, admired her exceedingly. Captain Wentworth looked round at her instantly in a way which showed his noticing of it. He gave her a momentary glance, a glance of brightness, which seemed to say, that man is struck with you, and even I, at this moment, see something like Anne Elliot again. Austen does not describe any faces here. Wentworth's head moves, but Austen doesn't describe any specific movement of eyes or mouth. There's no obvious naming of emotion here either. But it is nevertheless a really powerful moment of recognition and acknowledgement through the medium of two glances. Wentworth sees Anne anew through the eyes of another man. And it is really important for Austen that this man's gaze, this stranger's gaze, is not lubricious or improper. His class and bearing are completely gentlemanly. So his admiring look is thus validated by the narrator as worthy of our attention and consonant with the cultural and class-based ethics of proper behaviour in the novel, even though it's not a visual moment. Wentworth's own quick glance has three components that command our attention. First, I want to stress this, it's a gift to Anne. He gave her a momentary glance. It's a gift, something he gives her. And as such, it recalls, I think, their previous intimacy, as well as opening up the possibility of renewing such intimacy. This is the beginning of what we now call unresolved sexual tension that drives this plot strand of the novel. Second, it's a glance of brightness that we can imagine as lighting up his own face, as he also looks with renewed interest on her own. And thirdly, most importantly for me, Austen then deploys what I call the speaking face trope, where the face is actually given its own language. In this trope, a face is not only expressive of an emotion, it seems to speak in its own silent discourse, its own language. The face is given its own rhetoric, its syntax, its grammar, its vocabulary. Wentworth's face here speaks in a really complex sentence that moves from what Wentworth seems to see in the other man's expression to what he sees as he looks anew at Anne, and the comparison with what seems to be his memory of Anne Elliot, the woman he used to love. 3 times, Austen stresses how quickly this happens. It's instantaneous, it is momentary, and it is transient in this moment. Yet, if the time of action is fast, narrative time slows right down here. This glance of brightness is thus analysed in some detail. And this slowness gives the reader time to work their way back into the understanding of this expression and its significance. At the level of dramatic action, it's just a quick glance as the stranger passes. At a narrative level, action slows right down to emphasize and reveal the workings of the gaze and the way a glance between two people can carry a tremendous weight of mutual recognition, understanding, and feeling. This trope is first used in English by Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century. He's translating a work by Boccaccio from Italian. And it has a long, though as yet unwritten history in English literature. And that's one of the things that this research project is going to do, to try and write a history of that trope. From what we have found so far, when the face speaks in this as if or seeming to say mode, the face always speaks, that is, the words, the sentences that the face speaks are always expressed in the first person and in the present tense. And it's always truthful in fiction. So in fiction, we know that faces, and in drama, as Tyne is saying, faces can express all kinds of emotion. They can tell stories that are true or false. Faces in fiction and drama can express or mask true feelings, but the rhetorical conventions of the speaking face suggest that facial discourse of this form does not lie. This is not to say that all characters can read faces accurately, but readers of fiction can. So this is, I guess, my argument that literature creates an artificial world, if you like, a world of artificial intelligence, perhaps, in which readers are interpolated as perfectly reliable face readers. They can do what other characters can't. And in fact, there's a lovely moment in another Jane Austen novel where Austen says of one unthinking character, oh, she was not in the habit of reading faces. She was not in the habit of reading expressions on people's faces. So there's a hierarchy that develops between characters that are good and bad at it and the reader themselves, who is always interpolated as being good at it. The rhetorical trope of the speaking face is also naturalized in everyday speech. We use it all the time. We use it in political commentary. We use it when we put captions on photographs of our pets, on our babies. It's there in popular song. But it is still, I think, a complex trope that has been developed in tandem with the conventions of the novel. It has a long literary history, and one that also performs a pedagogical function. So the speaking face trope doesn't translate visual images. There's no visual image there to translate. Rather, it seems to produce, it gives the impression of producing a visual image through its appeal to a shared or common understanding of how a face might seem to speak, and more precisely, what a face that could be said to say, that man is struck with you, etc., might look like. Equally, this trope, I think, also encourages the reader to feel how their own face might move if it were to express such a feeling. This is what Guillemette Ballance calls kinesic knowledge, and that's why it's so great having Guillemette working with us on this project. And also in this romantic context of persuasion, this trope encourages us to think what it might feel like to receive such a glance, in this case, as a gift from an old lover. This is a very different world from the simple equivalence of a static image of a face paired with a single emotion word, happiness, anger, for example. So it's a world away from Paul Ekman's taxonomy of faces. Austen's is a particularly complex example of the speaking face, I admit that, but it demonstrates for us how literary expression and the textures of language can produce layers of mediated intelligence that combine emotion, expression, and this very distinctive rhetoric of the face. Through that very simple tag, seemed to say, the reader's emotions and their embodied cognition are brought into play as full participants in the production of meaning. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was so fascinating and a brilliant excursion through the worlds of the novel, theatre, even moving back to Chaucer. There are so many questions, so many questions that emerged there around key ideas that move across the kind of work that our panelists are doing, questions of truth, fiction, authenticity, and revelation and concealment. I'm going to throw the microphone now to Vanessa as we move from the world of literature into the world of art and digital art to hear some more. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Kate for the invitation. Just a quick word before I begin. The flat underneath me is being renovated, and today they've chosen to use jackhammers and drills and all kinds of loud equipment. So if at any point I'm having trouble with noise interruption, you may see me put on this beautiful pair of delightful noise cancelling headphones. I'm not very good at focusing when there's background noise, so I just thought I would let you know in case I have an emergency costume change, that's what's happening. Equally, if anybody has any issues with background noise stopping them from being able to hear me, please let me know. So it's a pleasure to follow Stephanie's presentation. I also want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I am presenting on this afternoon, and to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm a curator. I'm interested primarily in artists who explore our human relationship with technology. And as Tyne said at the beginning, my research investigates how artists and curators allow us to reimagine technological and networked lives, specifically in relation to questions of well-being, agency, and digital ethics. My current project is an exploration of the design of interfaces. So more and more we are navigating our relationship with the world through interfaces that are designed to produce particular kinds of behavioral outcomes in the users. So a very good example is the way that, Facebook uses notifications, the color red, to produce a kind of reaction in people where you feel like it's urgent to respond to that notification or to click on that advert. And we're increasingly living with these interfaces that produce these particular emotions in us that point us towards commercial outcomes particularly. And so usually as academics and people who want to understand the effect of technology on humans, we might turn to a discourse such as human-computer interaction to understand what that means for us. And what I've become interested in and what I'm exploring in my research is how, in fact, artists can help us understand the effects of these interfaces on humans and our engagement with interfaces. And very often we don't actually know how to describe the effect of art and aesthetic experience. So it can make it very difficult to speak tangibly about what technology does in terms of helping us think differently about the relationship between technologies and humans. So my research is really an attempt to speak into this gap. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive on one of my case studies. And I think there will be some really lovely points of synergy with what Stephanie has said. So I'm going to talk about a project called Are We All Addicts Now, which is a collaboration that I did with a British artist called Catriona Beals. This was a project we worked also with Fiona MacDonald, who's also a British artist, and a neuroscientist called Henrietta Bowden-Jones, who's the UK's sort of leading expert on the emerging diagnosis of internet addiction. And this was an exhibition that used video projection and sculpture, installation, interactive artworks, and even used some eye tracking software as well. So lots of different media to explore the question of the design of interfaces. So Catriona was really the artist who got me interested in this question of how are artists rethinking how interfaces are designed and the particular emotions that interfaces are trying to produce in us as humans. So Are We All Addicts Now was really an exploration of that issue. Now I'm going to quickly share my screen with you. Share and slide view. Can everybody see that okay? Can you just give me a thumbs up? Okay, brilliant. Yep. Thank you. So this rather busy slide has some images from Catriona's exhibition. I'm just going to describe what you can see here. So one of the images is a work called Network Bed, which is a bed that was built into the floor of the gallery, and it was lined with this very soft velvet, and people were invited to climb down into it and wear headphones and listen to some audio. And you can also see that there's a little glass sculpture nestled in the corner there. On the other side, you can see one of these glass sculptures in more detail. So this is better lit than the other one. So you can see the particular qualities of texture and surface and light and color that Catriona was playing with in her work. So this is a little glass sculpture sitting on a glass table, and in it you can see the reflection of a projection that was on the ceiling above. Now, for me, Catriona's talent as an artist is that she's very good at using materials and sculptural form to invite people to consider their slightly more ambiguous and difficult to articulate dimensions of their relationship to technology. And so I think that's often the particular skill of aesthetic experience, the way that uses particular qualities of material and light and texture and sound to make us think differently about human experiences. And so in my role as researcher, I'm really interested in trying to understand a bit more about how this works. So over the images in front of you, there are some quotations which I gathered from audiences during their time in the exhibition. It's really hard to try and quantify aesthetic experience. And what I say about these quotes is that they are examples of emerging affects and experiences that people have during the exhibition, which are particular to this group of people, but nonetheless reveal something interesting about what the experience meant for them. And so I'm just going to quickly read through these because I find them quite compelling. So that's very disconcerting, that contrast with the softness and the flatness and the brightness of the screens and the vivid colors. And then to have that kind of yielding, amorphous softness, I think we go back to unsettling, supposed to be comfortable, but actually a bit worrying. I was just thinking about boxes of chocolates. So when you bite into a chocolate and the texture is very different inside to how you expected it to be, it's like what that sense of having different textures, the glass and the velvet, made me think about. Reminds me of being a child and wanting to stroke soft things as well, but then you stroke it the wrong way. Yes, that too. It's like stroking an animal the wrong way. It's unsettling again, that feeling in your hands or maybe your whole skin that you've done the wrong thing. So what I think audiences are talking about here is the particular affordances of this aesthetic experience and how the materials help them think slightly differently about how they relate to technology in the everyday. So they are unsettled, they are surprised, they are slightly grossed out. And they may not know precisely why, but the aesthetic work that the artist has done here is to create a scenario and an experience that allows them to feel into this. And I think that's really a collaboration between an artist and an audience who bring their own experiences to bear on aesthetic material, on an experience in an exhibition, and are able to produce these quite poetic reflections on what the exhibition enabled them to explore. So I began by saying that interfaces increasingly try to produce these experiences for us where we are directed along quite linear pathways of emotion and experience towards particular behavioral outcomes. And I think, what artists do in the face of that is they keep creating these experiences that allow us to have complex emotional responses to the idea of technology. And, I think that's applicable across literature and different art forms. But what I've tried to show in this case study is the way that a media artist working with visual art enables one particular audience group to do that. And I love the fact talking about this as a response that happens in the skin, that feeling in your hands that maybe you've done the wrong thing. This is a really embodied response that allows us to feel into our relationship with technology. So I've said enough. I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Vanessa, and completely free of construction background noise. So excellent all round. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. There's so much to take away from that, especially thinking about the broad range of emotions that these kinds of aesthetic experiences in a gallery or in an artistic space are intentionally or not prompting in a person. I'm going to hand over to Mark as our final speaker. And just before I do, get you to think about any thoughts or questions that may come to mind and pop them in the chat so that I can have a chance to have a look at them and throw to some of our attendees today to get our speakers thinking about your questions. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Tyne, and thanks to Kate and everyone for having me as a panelist in today's talk. Before I begin, same as Vanessa, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in the lands of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past and present and emerging. So just to tie back to the subject matter at hand, we have discussions on art, on literature, and about digital ethics. That's what Kate's all about. So when I was approached to give this mini talk in the panel, I'm just thinking, what work can I use or showcase to tie with the various strands and get people talking and discussing? So then an aha moment came up when I realized that one of the side projects I've been doing, which I'm really passionate about, is in existentialist philosophy. And existentialism started as a movement in the mid-20th century after the war days. And how does it tie into literature? Well, I have here, hopefully you can see through the virtual background, Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. Beauvoir was known as an excellent novelist, but more importantly, she's a very prominent philosopher in existentialism and also in feminism. And so how does this tie in with digital ethics, you might ask? So starting this work about a few years ago, I've just been thinking, well, on social networks, ranging from the old school ones, from internet relay chat to Facebook that we probably all know, to the modern ones like TikTok, in effect, we are communicating with other people. They're not just bots out there. Chances are the humans outnumber the bots. And this got me thinking, so what concepts from existentialist philosophy can we apply to interrogate our relationship with not just the technology, but the others that the technology would mediate? And yep, that's the focal point of my research. Well, to get things started, I don't really have a slide, my apologies, but what I might do is, if that's all right, I'll share a screenshot of existentialism on the Phil Papers archive. It's basically a scholarly repository on lots of philosophical topics, and I edit the miscellaneous existentialism applications category. So hopefully that gives everyone a bit of context as what I'm saying. You can feel free to skim through the screenshot, but that's just there purely for context. So again, as I mentioned, after World War II, philosophers started thinking, well, what is life? What meaning do we have? And the whole school of existentialist philosophy actually started before that, in the days of philosophers like Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. That was way before that. But after World War II, because of the changing landscape, the uncertainties post-war, people start to think, is there any meaning as to what we're doing? Is everything inherently absurd? What agency do we have in this ever-changing world? Everything's beyond our control. And so those are some of the key topics we discover. But more importantly, this is quite pertinent now because in the days, well, not post-COVID, because we're not safely out of the woods just yet, but hopefully we will be, knock on wood. Social media is used as pretty much a refuge for us, especially in the tough days of lockdown, especially last year's Melbourne lockdown, which is quite long. We use social media to engage with other people, be in touch. In the case of TikTok, some of you might know the Fleetwood Mac song with someone on a roller skate, I think, drinking cranberry juice, that became a meme. So that just goes to show that we depend on social media, not for communication, but also for entertainment, for engagement, and to gain knowledge as well. So one of the aspects I research on is this prospect of authenticity, whereby especially people who are, for example, Instagram influencers, they go online and they have this notion that, yep, I want to be as authentic as possible on social media. Sometimes it's just for the sake of being authentic, but other times it's about, for example, how can I be authentic on social media so that people would appreciate that I'm authentic, and that would increase, for example, sponsorships or product placements. So that gets me thinking in existentialist philosophy. The concept of authenticity is, just to summarize it, there's many textbooks written about this, for example, from Guignon and Golem's work on existentialism. But the fact is, we all try to be authentic. The concept of authenticity is not even well described, but just is, we can probably never attain authenticity. It's about just the act of, we try to be as ourselves as possible. We don't try to sugarcoat our appearances online. And that's the heart of it. It's not some end goal we can become. So again, this ties into social media, where hang on, do we just go online for the sake of being online? When we write a post, do we want to share information, or do we want to curate a certain view that others from the outside looking in think we are actually? So this effort of curation has been discussed by philosophers like, for example, again, Guignon and Gollum come to mind, but Goffman, who's a sociologist, also came up with the idea of the various presentations of the everyday self. So what kind of presentation can we have on social media that makes us look authentic, or as authentic as possible? Is authenticity even achievable in the days of social media, or is it an impossible goal, and celebrities or Instagram influencers to claim they're authentic is not even able to do that from a phenomenological sense from philosophy? And just recap some highlights of research I've been doing in the past few years. In 2018, I looked at, in my previous institution, faces of people on Instagram who claim that they have no filter or live authentic, that those are the hashtags they use. And from that investigation, what I found is I've gone through about a few thousand Instagram photos after ethics board approval. And because I can't do everything by myself, I needed to use some machine learning tools from the Amazon cloud to help me find out what exactly is going on in those photos. And the results are some of the more interesting results. People just want to portray happiness in most cases, actually. Well, the happy self is claimed to be an authentic self, and basically people just want to put their best foot forward, their best presentation to the whole world. And that going on to social media, that exudes some kind of vulnerability, because if we're trying to curate our best possible selves online, are we being vulnerable in the sense that we're not really showcasing who we truly are and just pretending on screen? And more importantly, implications of this, for example, if I were to be an Instagram influencer online, claiming that I'm really authentic, you should really follow me because if you like what you see. But in the background, what I'm truly trying to do is get my follower count up because I want, for example, more sponsors to notice me. That itself is at the antithesis of being authentic, because that's just me doing a performance act to get my social media followers to follow me and using them as an instrument. So going back to existentialist philosophy, there are many other strands of the research that I probably won't have time for, but because social media is a necessary evil nowadays, I think more scholars should look to existentialist philosophy and basically even the whole discipline of phenomenology to interrogate our relationship with technology, and more importantly, with the others who are actually fellow human beings. Hopefully I've stuck to time, and yep, that's 10 minutes.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Round of applause. So we've covered a lot of terrain in a short period of time here. We've moved from Jane Austen through to aesthetic experiences in the gallery, through to TikTok, Instagram, and social media, and the kinds of fabricated and fragmented and constructed identities that people stitch together these days in terms of presenting themselves, not just to the world, but to a kind of constructed idea of their audience online that they're very much curating in a sophisticated way. So it seems to me we've got kind of questions floating here of the ethics of authenticity, the kinds of selves that we present, and also in response to that, the kinds of technology that is emerging that attempts to read those different kinds of selves. So I have a couple of questions that I've thought up in response to our speakers. If anyone has one they'd like to verbalize, feel free to pop your hand up, or the little reaction, you can raise a hand in your Zoom screen or put one in the chat. But I might start with just a kind of general question about emotions, if that's okay for our panelists. And while you were all speaking, I got to thinking a bit about the kinds of emotions that have emerged, not just in response to new forms of technology, but in response to those kinds of technology in the context of a global pandemic. And I also then thought of a New Yorker article that had quite a lot of circulation quite recently, in which the author espoused this term languishing, which was a term that was being used to refer to a kind of what the author was saying was a new emotion that has emerged in response to the general malaise of global chaos, technology, surveillance, and a whole range of other factors. Deborah Lupton, who some of you might be familiar with, has sort of also talked about the concept of data selves and the idea that our online selves in particular are now comprised of a whole range of data that's being used, scraped, and generated in different ways beyond our knowledge and control. So a general question to our audience, and full disclaimer that this may be an unanswerable one, but do you think technology and the 21st century context has created new kinds of emotions? And if so, perhaps how would we describe those? And across these forms, we've been canvassing literature, art, curatorial practice, online media. How do you think different kinds of mediums are responding to the generation and the feeling of new kinds of emotions, particularly those that we might not have definitions or terms for yet? Stephanie, jump in.
Thank you, Tyne, and thank my other fellow panelists. That is such a great question, Tyne. My answer is not really about literature, but it is about communication, which is increasingly face-to-face, but through mediated form, so using Zoom in particular. And for me, the real question is not so much whether it's producing a new emotion, but is actually producing a different kind of relationship between the face and emotion, in that when we are speaking at our beloved friends and family, half the time we're looking at ourselves at the same time as looking at other people. And that is just that's the real epistemic shift, if you like, from literature or from previous face-to-face communication in the real world. Because even in the real world, you don't see yourself expressing emotion or responding, but in mediated technological forms, you really do. And I suspect that's going to be one of the biggest changes. I can't say any more about it than that, but to me, that always strikes me when I'm seeing myself on Zoom, seeing myself talking to my dad, for example. Yeah.
Vanessa or Mark, any thoughts?
Yes, many thoughts. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like this impulse that we have to categorize emotion and to decide if an emotion is a new one or an old one. And I think this is a slightly sort of tangential response to your question, but it's what comes to mind. You know, I think we are always looking for signs of emotion in the face, because emotion is so blooming complex and the human condition is so incredibly complex. And so, you know, over the centuries, we've evolved various technologies to allow us to make sense of emotions and kind of, I think, bring them under control. So I'm really excited. I've got a phrenology head behind me. I don't know if people can see that. I've got lots of props for this afternoon's seminar. And phrenology is a kind of 18th century, I believe, system where people thought you could tell the nature of a person's personality by feeling the bumps in their head. And obviously, you know, a scientific system that's completely discredited now. But I think that impulse to think that we can read people through external signs that are kind of simple to categorize is, I think, a very old one. And so, you know, maybe this kind of surging forward of technologies like facial recognition and yeah, new ways of reading the face in technological form is actually a much kind of older impulse than a new one.
I think just to follow up on what Stephanie and Vanessa mentioned as well, in my studies on social media, at least, for example, if in a face-to-face setting, I know, for example, let's say I'm chatting to you, Tyne, I know if you get my message, or if you're confused, or if you're upset with what I said, or you subtly smile, that means something I've said, basically it's funny. But for example, on computer mediated communication like Twitter, for example, we won't really get what the other person's trying to say, be it sarcasm, embarrassment, being upset, etc. And one of the sad consequences of this would be, for example, people, because they can't see whoever they're talking to on the other side of the screen. That just opens them up to, for example, yep, I'm just going to be a keyboard hero and type offensive stuff that I would normally say in real life. So that empathy has been lost when you translate it to online communication. So that's my take on the whole thing.
Absolutely. There's so many worrying but fascinating threads across all of these. So we're kind of talking about questions of the extent to which technology can mediate and be involved in what are very much innate human interactions and emotional responses. And we have one question in the chat, which I just need to sort of read in a moment. But my next question to the panel, and this is one that's perhaps more directed at you, Vanessa, is and perhaps you too, Mark, in terms of digital ethics, art is always trying to push the boundaries, as is literature. It's trying to make us feel new things about new topics in new ways. Is there ever, in your opinion and in your practice, circumstances under which it's reasonable for art to play with our emotions in perhaps bad ways? And I'm thinking here of kind of genres like shock art, and art that's intended to perhaps not necessarily trigger, but draw down on particular kinds of emotions that might be considered not the terrain of an enjoyable artistic experience. Is there a fine line that you work on and think about where art sort of moves into the unethical terrain where certain kinds of responses or emotions are being prompted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting question. And having worked as a curator, I've worked with many artists who have wanted to sort of throw bricks through the windows of old historical and valuable buildings, and do things with bodily fluids and all of these kind of ethically problematic ideas. And I think for me, art should be hard. I think that's its value in a world which seems to seek out increasingly simplistic narratives and simplistic experiences. John Dewey, the philosopher of art, is really famous for saying that we learn through difficulty. We learn through difficult experiences. So difficult experiences can be a gift. And so often when I've curated exhibitions, I've tried to work with that. And, it's actually really difficult to create the right setting for somebody to have a difficult experience that turns out to be productive. There's an exhibition that took place at the Serpentine Gallery in London in 2018, which I was lucky enough to see, by an artist called Pierre Hoygi. And it was a work that used machine learning, where he trained a machine learning algorithm to basically reconstruct images of really mundane things like cats and mugs and tables and chairs. And these really beautiful, complex images were projected in the gallery in quite a large scale. And those images also responded to movement in the gallery. So he'd also filled the gallery with flies. So as you walked around this gallery, you were kind of surrounded by all these buzzing flies, which was a really kind of quite upsetting and difficult experience as a viewer. But it was also incredibly powerful in terms of working with some of those things that I talked about in my presentation around the unnerving and the uncanny, and just communicating that slight unnervedness, which I think a lot of us feel in relation to technology, but we don't necessarily know how to express it and articulate it. So, I mean, that exhibition is one of my favorite things I've ever seen, but it wasn't necessarily a pleasurable, beautiful experience. And I think that is where art is actually most useful.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very detailed and impressive answer. On this question of unnervedness and uncomfortableness, I might go to the question in the chat from Brian, and it seems to me, Stephanie, this one might be more directed at you. And we're thinking here about technology, especially distortion and productions of faces, as Brian notes, that are designed to manipulate us and that are deterministic in some way. Is there a sense in which the novel can help us understand and cope with what is an entirely new bombardment of, precisely as you said, Stephanie, with Zoom, new ways of having to mediate and understand our own faces in weird contexts?
Yes, thanks, Brian. It's such a great question. I've been staring at it for the last few minutes, just thinking, what am I going to say? And as it's clear, I mean, I'm primarily a medievalist. I don't work yet very much on contemporary fiction, which I suspect is where these issues are going to be raised more directly, like in sci-fi or in fiction that actually foregrounds the digital. But my hunch is that, in fact, the place where that is happening most is in the world of cinema and film rather than in fiction. And in a way, I kind of think that's the best thing that fiction can do. It can actually work best by preserving that space where you can read unobserved. And I think that still most fiction takes for granted the fact that, it's directed towards a reader reading on their own, in privacy, where your responses are completely private to you. So perhaps it's almost like fiction is that the space of fiction is a kind of like a safe space from that. Although I do think that fiction will increasingly address those concerns. The other possibility is to think about the way that fiction is increasingly being written in graphic form. So graphic novels and graphic nonfiction, where you actually have the play of image and text. I think that is also a really productive space for thinking about those issues. But it's a really good question. I think also Marina's question is really in a very similar space to that sense that we are being watched. And I suppose sites like Goodreads, where you are encouraged to feedback your response to fiction, is a place where you might be being observed and your responses are probably being gathered. What kind of novels do you like, and what ones will we feed you in advertising and so forth? But I think probably still that place that even if you're reading on a computer or on face-to-face with a book, it's a nice expression, face-to-face with a book, that space is still, I think, still a space that is free from being watched in the same way. It's not a good answer, but I think it's such a great question.
It is a great answer, because all of the things that you've said there, Stephanie, have made me kind of take Marina's question and think about it in the context. And here's where I'll throw to you, Mark, of social media. And I raise that because, as Stephanie's touched on, literature and particularly to art are domains that privilege close reading of texts, of images, of sound, of experience. They're the domains that we engage in where we're kind of distanced from the fragmentation and the immediacy often of online contexts. And I wonder, and this is perhaps a question that might be better directed at a neuroscientist than a digital ethicist and philosopher, but do you think there's something going on with the kind of online watching and the emotions and attention span that are changing in response to that, that's almost changing the shape and the range of our brains in that online space, particularly with regards to fragmented images and faces and emotion? And are there actually ways to counteract that? Or Mark, do you think that we've reached a point where we're actually too far gone?
So good question, Tyne. Disclaimer, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'll try to answer it based on, this is based on literature I've read to prepare a paper for a couple months ago. So good timing for that question. So in many studies, they've discovered that the engineers behind, for example, the Facebook news feed are just basically using neuroscience principles to give us dopamine hits. So let's say a notification just pops up about a potential movie that my mate, whom I haven't spoken to in a long time, pops up. I feel happy, and in turn it learns, okay, if you talk about Rob and movies, you click on that notification. So it'll probably give us more and more feeds or notifications or updates about films, and that's a self-reinforcing loop, because it knows that we'll get a dopamine hit. We'll click on it to get a dopamine hit, and that reinforces or wires the circuits in our brain such that we get addicted to notifications. And this is observed quite often where, let's say in a cafe, there's the whole Facebook pop. Everyone looks at their phones because it's the same Facebook pop for everyone. That's the sound effect. To counter that from a macro level, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just keep my answer brief. There's this amazing paper, I just brought it up on my other screen, which is where I'm tracking my literature reviews. Ward has a paper on how we can apply Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative to help stop or at least mitigate these things. For example, how do we stop us from being micro-targeted behaviorally. So suggestions would be install things like ad blockers, etc., to try, we know it's happening, to try to just scratch our profile so we can't be profiled that effectively. And that is a Kantian duty we can all adopt. It's tough, but it's doable. So even, for example, if we know how we're being micro-targeted, we can learn to just ignore those nudges or hints that, hey, there's a dopamine hit waiting for you. Do you want to click it? That's where, as an existentialist, you can probably also exercise your choice saying, yeah, nah, no, thank you. So yep, that's a short answer from both perspectives.
Thank you. And on that note, furthermore emphasis that if we're not already in the age where philosophers and software developers need to work together, we certainly are now. We have 1 minute spare, so I'm going to wrap things up now and give a great thanks to our fantastic panelists. I have learned so much in 1 hour, and I hope that all of you who came along this afternoon did as well. Thank you very much, Professor Stephanie Trigg, Dr. Vanessa Bartlett, and our last minute guest star appearance from Dr. Mark Chong. This series, Technology and the World Around Us, has only just begun. Thank you very much to Cade for putting it on and hosting us. The next session in the series, as far as I'm aware, is looking at the intersection of technology and animals. There'll be a lot more information coming out about that. Stay tuned. Keep following us along online, and thank you all very much for attending.